Thank you for the introduction. And I noticed that there's a lot of faces in the room that I know, so it's great to see familiar faces. I will just note that Nora said first a couple slides, which then became a few slides.
No, like two slides.
Well, there was an intro slide and there was one slide.
Okay.
So we had two with an introductory slide. So it's not, yeah. So thank you for the introduction. I just will say a couple words. I think it's really great that we put this all together today. I see it as a kind of an extension of a lot of the informal conversations that we've been having on the sidelines. So just to let you know, just to reiterate, I am not giving a talk today, right? And this is not a formal talk. We had a talk yesterday about pre-modern spatial humanities. We have tomorrow a learning session thinking about contextualizing GIS in open frameworks. It's not exclusively about QGIS. It's going to be thinking about what are open ways of mapping, which I know in a place like that's close to Silicon Valley and close to sort of proprietary software universes might be a kind of a radical thing to do, but hopefully that will be an interesting conversation. So, and then we have on Friday this really great celebration of many years of the curation of an important data set, which we hope will really transform the way that the study, and not just the digital study, but also the digital computational study of the Arabian Peninsula will take off in years to come. So today's title was not my own title, it was given to me, but I will just say a couple words about it. So global approaches to multilingual data practices and digital humanities, right? So global approaches, global is an interesting word, right? We all know, right? It's a difficult word. It's a troubling word. It's also a troubling word to use in the United States, by the way, because it's so often kind of thrown around as meaning inclusive of the entire world. I'm not going to use it in that particular, but keeping the US at the center of that. I'm not going to try to use it that way today, but rather global to mean something more like there's a lot of ways that things happen in the world, right? And some of which actually exclude the United States or practice of the United States or run counter to what's actually happening here. So I want to keep that a little bit in the back of our minds. And also digital humanities. I sit on this kind of digital / computational humanities divide. Very interested in that, very interested in theorizing that, thinking about what it can mean. I think that the digital humanities and multilingualism or multilingual data practices is something a little bit different from the computational humanities and multilingual. But one thing I will also just foreground before opening up to this admittedly sort of just random set of questions that I put together in the last half hour is that I have been doing a lot of work with people in a space that we're calling multilingual digital humanities, in which we've been publishing some kind of strange articles lately. If you put in my name and look for multilingual DH, they will surface. This is with a group that's situated mostly in Europe and myself, but people who are in different versions of area studies, people who are particularly interested in non-Latin scripts. So scripts that are not looking like the English script. So we have a sinologist, we have a Japanologist, we have an Arabist, we have myself, we have different people who are, and so for us, script and directionality and language, right, are all kind of inflecting and interesting ways of looking at the problem of DH, not just from a representational or like a presentational perspective on a screen, but from an infrastructural perspective, right? Like it's actually hard for us all to get onto the same page because we have so many obstacles. So we have some interesting work that's been done. So I'm talking about Cosima Wagner from Freie Universität in Berlin. I'm talking about Alice Horvath from Central European University now in Vienna, who's formerly in Hungary. And then our previous collaborator, Cornelis van Lith, who is now transitioned out of academia. But that group is sits in along with Daria. So if those of you are familiar with European infrastructures for digital humanities, there's a group in Daria. There's also a group inside of multiple organizations, and everyone seems to be wanting to kind of triangulate and figure out how we can put this conversation together. So this summer at the Ad Hoc conference in Lisbon, we are going to be working up a new version of our manifesto for multilingual digital humanities, which is going to be circulating in the world and bringing in all kinds of community content, community input. It's one of our things is trying to go out into the world and find what people have to say about their experience of working in the languages that they do and in digital or computational humanities. So if you're going to be in Lisbon, please join us for that. If you're not, there should be opportunities for some kind of remote comments on that. We really see this as actually a global thing to do, right? By which we mean engaging people all over the world, not just talking about the rest of the world. So the last thing that I will say there is that the other piece of this kind of multilingual digital humanities has been for us the breaking down of the distinction between multilinguality and multilingualism, right? Which is a distinction that not everybody makes, right? But multilingualism, from a linguist point of view, typically tends to be a very centralized, sometimes even state-centered approach, thinking about what are the languages that particular territories think about, and what are the languages that, if we translate that into an infrastructural world, that has to be kind of like, that have to be supported. Whereas multilinguality is more like what we see in the room. I don't know the languages that are present in the room, nor do I know, and I don't just mean the native languages of the people in the room or the languages that you identify with in the room, but what are all the research languages that we see in the room, and what are all the possible configurations and not configurations, that's the word I'm looking for, permutations, right, of different languages together that make up scholarly practice. And how does that, all those permutations, how do those interface with research infrastructures? And so one of the things we've been doing is gathering data from people about what they do, how they want infrastructures to work for them, what they encounter as problems. Of course, you can imagine that some people have very, very, very bespoke problems that not a lot of people in the room have. There's other people who are all on similar pages, right, with lots of common shared problems. And so this kind of like telling the story of infrastructure from its users and their discontents has been a real like research axis for us in recent years. And so that sort of combined with the manifesto that's going to take place this summer is, we are hoping will be a kind of a groundswell moment where the community talks, right? And that community talking about what it needs, hopefully, although we're not sure, right, will begin to grab the attention of things like professional societies, the people who do the job of supporting infrastructure in the world, right? Obviously, we can't solve all the problems of all the people, but we can sort of think together more about like how our particular permutations of languages can be better supported to do the kind of work that we do. So it really becomes a question of like a research data management or research services question. So I told you I was getting a talk today. That's a little bit of background about what I've been thinking about in recent years. So what I thought we might do today is, I think it would be a great idea to just have maybe a name and what you and how we can introduce people.
Maybe name where you're located in Stanford. There's a lot of people here who I don't know, and I'll start. And then maybe what brings you to this conversation, why this was a title that brought you to SESTA today.
Yeah.
And maybe it would be useful to list research languages. Is that too much?
That'd be super interesting to know. I mean, you don't have, that might get overwhelming also with the number of people in the room. So feel free to represent yourself in whatever way you want.
Briefly.
I will say some things we might want to think about as a leading of a conversation today, right? How do we define and delimit multilingual in our projects?
Mm-hmm.
How do global digital humanities projects, again, or research more generally, recognize and center local language expertise, right? We certainly have had that issue come up in OpenGulf a lot, right? How do we bring particular expertise to doing certain tasks in workflows at different points? What infrastructure exists for dominant versus minority languages? How are multilingual methods taught in DH curricula around the world? Quinn would be a great person to ask that, because I've been sort of thinking a lot about that, right? how can community-driven or regional data sets counterbalance linguistic bias? What are successful models of co-authoring corpora? What does a truly multilingual digital humanities ecosystem look like for you? Those are just some ideas, just to get people's brains sort of going. So maybe we can have name, where you are in Stanford, and
I'm about to model.
Model it.
I'm going to model it.
We're having a modeling of the community
Okay.
conversation beginning.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nora Barakat. I am an assistant professor in the history department. I teach modern Middle East history there and late Ottoman history. I also co-direct the OpenGulf project with David, which is a project that began when we were in Abu Dhabi and has become an international animal. It was always an international animal in a way, global, you could say. I come at this, I think that's all the things I was supposed to say. Locating myself in Stanford, name, and the OpenGulf piece. I come at this conversation, I think about multilingual DH quite a bit, both from the OpenGulf perspective and thinking about, as David was saying, how to really mobilize, especially students' linguistic abilities, to mobilize them towards doing research with historical texts that is in multiple languages. The one that I've done the most with that is Arabic, but I have dreams of doing it also to a certain extent with Turkish and Ottoman Turkish, and dreams of doing it with Persian and other languages which were spoken, used, written in, etc., in the Gulf region in that context, for the OpenGulf context. I've also forayed in various ways into the world of Arabic handwritten text recognition, and have another project that is intimately related with OpenGulf, trying to create models for transcription of handwritten Ottoman era Arabic stuff. And so that's another plate, like that's the piece I feel like where I spend a lot of time thinking about the infrastructure issues that David was talking about, and something where I've learned a lot. Which platforms are we using? What's user friendly for students, etc. What I did not model well just now was brevity. You can be much more brief than that, right? Maybe you just thought the name of the talk today, the conversation was cool. And that is like absolutely okay. But since I'm sitting in the front of the room, I modeled badly. Ali, tell us about yourself.
Hello, Ali Ajolu. I'm associate professor in the history department, long athlete of CESTA. And I'm running two projects. One is the old Ottoman Epirus, which is on 18th and 19th century Adriatic Greece. It includes mapping, archive building, kind of things. And the other is charting the empire, which is on the fiscal data and fiscal archives of the Ottoman Empire, 18th, 19th centuries again. I'm just, languages, research languages, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic Persian, Ottoman Persian, Ottoman Arabic, different than regular Arabic.
Yes.
And Greek and Ottoman Greek with lots of Albanian language. And yeah, I'm interested in, among other things, multilinguality, obviously, but also two things. One is I'm interested in different hands. So how different calligraphic cultures actually can be studied digitally. When you say that I'm working on Ottoman Turkish would not be enough, because especially for the archival research, you have different hands. You have to train yourself. It took me 1 year to train myself on this fiscal shorthand. And so this is one interesting thing. And hands also related to language, because this fiscal hand is more Persianate than other hands, for instance. There's interesting correlation between different calligraphic styles and language. And then the larger issues about data. So I'm working on Ottoman data and how the Ottoman fiscal experts created their own data, and how we created our own data, and so basically translating two data. So I'm not imposing my data on the Ottomans and on the women. I rather, understand the way that they think about their own knowledge production and knowledge systematization, and and make sense of it and then create their own thing. So yeah, these are.
Hi, my name is Chloe. I am finishing currently a PhD in comparative literature. So you'll have to excuse me if I leave before the end because I'm teaching and finishing my dissertation. I'm very advanced right now. But I actually take the opposite approach of what Nora has described. I have two projects here at Stanford that I've hired undergraduate researchers to collaborate along with, and I haven't required them to have reading knowledge of French to be my collaborators. I have over almost 2 years assembled different corpora of little magazines published in Quebec in the 1970s, from the 1960s through the 1980s, focusing on the 1970s, and developed a handful of research questions that were fine-tuned not only with my domain expertise, but also with the sort of computational expertise of the students. And I think that in those experiences, we were able to, push each other to do better research, but not with that language requirement at the door. Perhaps in the future, I'll become more ambitious in terms of using the skill sets of the researchers present to me. But again, centering the United States, American University, limited resources and time of being a graduate student. But that's sort of the state of the multilinguality of my work.
Hi everyone, I'm Ritu. I'm an undergrad in Chicano Latino Studies and Islamic Studies. So I've done research before on Spanish-English code switching using computational linguistics for that. So yeah, I'm just interested in learning more about multilingual digital humanities and currently learning Arabic. So would love to do research in Arabic someday, inshallah. We'll see. Hi, I'm Atika. I'm in second year in the Department of Art and Art History. And I'm just broadly interested in digital humanities. Want to perhaps develop a project that combines GIS and caste in South Asia and public desecration of statues.
I'm Julia. I'm a third-year history PhD student. I've hurried a little bit into DH with OpenGulf and helped disambiguate some of the data sets. So I'm excited to be here.
I'm Mustafa, second-year PhD in history. I've been working with Nora for the last 2 years, and I think today's talk is quite relevant for me because my research languages are also Ottoman Turkish and Arabic.
And Persian.
Hopefully.
Grab on.
Hi, I'm Anne-Lydia McDivitt. I am academic technology specialist for Department of History. I'm also in research data services in the libraries. And I am here because I want to help people do this kind of stuff, and I'm not good at it yet. So I like to hear what people are doing and, all kinds of different thoughts, because I've always done DH in English and that's it. And so I want to be able to better support history.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm a AI machine learning researcher and software developer in research data services in the libraries. My background is in South Asian and East Asian studies, and my research languages are Chinese, Japanese, Sanskrit, and related languages. I've been involved in that kind of stuff for a very long time. I was involved in the Unicode proposal that put Koroshti into Unicode about 15 years ago, something like that. I also chair ADHO's infrastructure committee. So
You are the committee.
Effectively, yeah. So yeah, lots of fingers in lots of multilingual DH pies from lots of perspectives.
Hi, I'm Julian. I'm head of data science training and consultation in research data services at the libraries. I actually have a PhD in history, and I wrote a dissertation on the evolution of family law in the 20th century Japanese Empire. So my research languages are mostly Japanese, but I have some other sort of vernacular sources from Chinese and Korean. So I actually wasn't able to read 90% of the material, the local court cases that I've acquired. So I'm hoping maybe one day I'll be able to do something computationally with the sources. I mean, all these local court cases are they're handwritten. So it's really hard to read even for a human reader. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm Peter. I'm also an AI ML developer in research data services. I've worked on a lot of digital humanities projects over the years in many languages. My actual background is in musicology. So I actually don't read or speak any of the languages of the DH projects I've worked on. But then again, no one really speaks music either. So I think infrastructurally, there are some parallels that are kind of interesting.
Hi, my name is Haidar. I'm the Middle East and North Africa curator at the Library Archive Global Institution. I work on acquiring a lot of different type of collections. My work is really here also to help scholars and researchers to provide content. So one of the recent projects I worked in, having Arabic content or Apache content to translate it to English. And then I start seeing the student just only working on the English document as the source of the materials, and I get more worried. And I'm using AI applications and translation, creating that description, just try to see with your experience, especially back in the region, and how that, to what percentage you would say to rely on these resources as primary resources, but it's not actually.
Hi, I'm Caleb. I'm an undergrad in the public policy department, and I came here because I'm interested in learning about multilingual data sets. I'm really interested in how we can use multilingualism in education, especially in using home languages to develop greater understanding of educational content and the language that's used around them in the community. So yeah, I'm interested in learning how we can apply digital humanities to that.
I'm Lorenzo. I'm a first year PhD student at the graphics department. Working on language lit. My research languages are Latin and Ancient Greek, and hopefully Arabic one day. I'm working on ancient mathematics. I mentioned like science texts, and multilingualism is very prominent in those cases. Like Latin and Greek, and especially Greek and Arabic, are always present. So this kind of approach is very interesting.
Maybe we can move back around.
Okay, yeah. Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal. I'm an undergrad studying data science and English. Let's see if I finish my double major. I'm also a SESTA undergrad RA. So a lot of what they do in the lunch seminars impact like directly the stuff I'm doing with my PI. I'm really interested. I came specifically. I sometimes don't come to these, but when I like skip my class to come here today because I'm also enrolled in this, so they're just competing with each other. But I'm working on a class project that is working with like comparing like sentiment between across different languages. And this might be really helpful.
Yeah.
Nice.
Hi everyone. I'm Wei-Jin. I am a first year master in symbolic systems, and I'm mostly working on English language literature. I work with the Stanford Literary Lab on different literary analysis projects. We're potentially collaborating with like scholars from Germany working on like German language fiction as well, but like it's like just a potential, and I myself haven't had like any experience working with multilingual data, so I'm just came here just to curious to learn more about like the tools and like what kind of platforms will support.
I'm Siv, first year PhD. I'm broadly interested in digital humanities and currently working on a project on like vanishing Sarambi mosque architecture in Kerala. So it's like very indigenous techniques and like local aesthetics of things like that. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Sciuperani. I'm in the Department of Classics, like Lorenzo. I'm also the faculty director of SESTA, and it has been a privilege of this position to be exposed to multilingualism because so many faculty work with different languages and become aware of these issues more. In my own work, it's mostly English, Italian, and other modern European languages. But there are two things that are on my mind recently in terms of multilingualism. One is, what do I do with, as we do our data for 18th century, with multilingualism expressed in terms of someone writing a foreign name, and like
typos, like across languages, so like what happens with that in terms of data. And then also in terms of data structure, when I hear and I don't know what to do with it, like yet or how anyone has been thinking about this, that we can go more, we can be very attentive to more other languages, but how much of this digital infrastructure that has been built based in English carries on as we expand to other languages or not. So that two things.
Hello, I'm Ed Tang, first year PhD student in plastics. I think I'm here today mostly because I actually don't know a lot about multilingual DH, so that's why I'm here today.
Hi, I'm Dia. I'm an undergrad research assistant like Crystal, and I'm working on the Senegalese Liberation Project, which is in English and French. And I'm here because I want to learn more about, I guess, just like the translation. I know one person mentioned how the writing down names in different languages, like that's very pertinent to my project. So I'm excited to be here.
Everyone, my name is Adam. In Adrian and Latin American Culture Department and in STS. Yeah, I just wrote my honors thesis on the politics of healing in indigenous literature. So I read like poetry in Spanish and Aztec, Maya to variations of Maya and Tzotzi. So I don't speak those languages. I do speak Nahuatl, which is another indigenous language in Mexico, and that's something that I do more research on because that's the language I'm comfortable with. But I've also participated in data inclusion and data governance projects in Oaxaca with other 5 indigenous communities. So I'm very interested in multilingualism and specifically indigenous languages in Mexico.
Hi, Marva. I'm doing a PhD in history and a master's in symbolic systems. And I work a lot in multilingual digital humanities, including I'm the co-convener of an SIG at ADHO, Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations on multilingual digital humanities, integrating that more structurally within the institutional systems of digital humanities. And I work with a lot of Turkish, mostly for my digital work, but also with like Polish and like with like more German.
So, and thanks to that, the SIG, the special interest group that Merva is a part of, we got this onto the ADHO agenda for this year and for the summer. And because those SIGs have a guaranteed slot, which are nice people to have on your side, right, for a whole conversation about this. So I think that the question about a manifest, first of all, I just want to say I'm kind of blown away by all the people who are in the room, different kinds of people who are in the room, not just the languages that are in the room, but actually just the different approaches and the different places people are coming from. If you are interested in this kind of approach where I am very tuned to this idea of listening to the stories of people and listening to what it is that they'd like to do and how that either matches or doesn't match, let's say, institutional priorities or technical services, or we do have this sort of interesting article called Centering Multilingual Users, which came out in Digital Studies a couple of years ago, in which we actually do a kind of a fictional panel at a fictional conference amongst people talking about the multilingual digital humanities. And one of the things that we argue in that article is that actually all the things that we've been talking about right now are amazing from a research perspective, but they also then need to be inserted inside of the social technical problems of the university and the power dynamics of universities, and to fully understand to what extent certain questions arise to the surface or not, right? And how things as simple as career status, right? Not simple, sorry, that's not simple. Things as powerful as career status or a point of career that someone's at, or their overlap with majority conversations in a particular environment about what languages matter, et cetera, have a difference, play a different role in the extent to which their projects get centered, right, in academic and societal conversations. So be interested, if you're interested, you can check that out. It's kind of a fun article. So where should we go with the conversation today? I think I think that when the perspective that Nora and I have come to this with through the OpenGulf project is that actually working with to work with a lot of the materials that we have, you don't actually need, not all of them, but you don't have to have incredible linguistic knowledge to work with them, right? So a little similar, right, to what you were talking about, Chloe. I mean, I think that probably your ability to navigate French texts, given that they're written in a Latin language, looking for things like, I don't know, capital letters for names of proper names, or being able to basically understand paragraphs or the directionality of a beginning and ending of a sentence, something like, if you have one Latin language, you can kind of jump over to that. I guess, maybe, feel free to chime in if you think I'm wrong, but in our case, what we're sort of dealing with is with a much more like multi-layered and complicated set of problems, right? Because, so just to give you a little bit of context, imagine that what you're taking is actually an English source, so a colonial source that's been published. But inside of that colonial source, there's all of these different kinds of remediated, if that's the right word, kind of all transformed other languages that are present, right? And so imagine that what you want to do is you want to have students be able to come to a tool which is designed to do semantic annotation of digital text, and what they actually have to do is find what is important, which is a toponym or a person name, some kind of proper name, and highlight it, something as simple as that in a digital interface, then having to confront the fact that they don't actually know fully what that thing is a stand-in for, because actually there's a term that sits behind it in another language. And the colonial era transcription of those words, well, they're not exactly the way that we do it nowadays, right? And can even be a distortion of that name, right? So it's almost like you have to know not just two languages to be able to survive there in that kind of an environment, but you have to understand all of the different cultural translations that went on between one language and another. And so I think that's what, I mean, that's kind of what, I'm not talking about the Ottoman texts, which is like a totally other question. But in those particular ones, is that fair to say that?
Yeah.
That's what we're looking for is kind of someone who can translate between these various levels of.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you working in an Arabic context or an Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish, Arabo-Persian script context, I mean, what that meant was looking for students who had, it could be first year Arabic, looking for students who knew the alphabet, so they would have an easier time dealing with that transcription world, right? Or looking like really having a more capacious idea of what language facility looks like. And I guess I'll just say for myself, like at Stanford, that this also became, and thinking about Chloe's, the challenges that Chloe's talking about, it also became a way for me to pull together students in this community of people interested in Arabic in all of its many forms, including in this transcripted, English colonial form at Stanford, right? Which when I got here, I realized was not something that existed in a very robust way, right? So thinking about that, we're going to give a talk Friday morning about workflow as a social technical problem, right? Thinking about the sociability of the workflow and of the research was another way, right, to sort of celebrate students who want to start with Arabic or want to work on or have a little bit of Arabic, as well as the ones who are native speakers and come in and can really sort of show more leadership there. And as we know at Stanford, some native speakers of Arabic, many of these languages don't, they might really be good at listening to it, but not reading it. I mean, it's just very, very multi-layered and complex. So and then we also have Muslim students who know the alphabet and know the Quran, but don't necessarily know Arabic. I mean, you can really pull together quite a lot, which is in a way analogous to you can read a sentence in French. I mean, it's domain, knowledge that is linguistic, but also other things, right? So, yeah, I guess I think coming at it with a broad sense of multilinguality
I would also add to that, that it can also be, because we're working with digital resources, an interesting thing that heritage speakers of a lot of languages can't do is type
Yeah.
in those languages, right? Which is actually like a super important thing, to be able to access a database or something, to be able to recognize on a multi-script keyboard like mine, that the sub is there or that this letter is there, and be able to just begin to access those digital resources. It's actually kind of tricky. And so there's obviously, that's a reason for bringing people into that, is that you actually get to learn those kinds of resources, those kinds of techniques when working. Yeah, Simon?
Are the texts that you're looking at in Arabic, for example, are they accessible to modern speakers easily, or?
So.
That's a complicated.
Right, that's kind of the
This
whole
is for everybody.
complication there, right?
There's like an interesting kind, I don't know why everybody in sort of library and a lot of data science people are sitting on this side of the room, but you somehow seem to have found each other on this side of the room, right? But that is a really interesting question for people working in, right, okay, so for the one that we're actually talking about on Friday, it's totally in English, anybody can read it. It's just one stumbles across lots of cultural materials that are difficult to understand.
5 million editions. And
on the other hand, we do have this question here, which is about infrastructure, like not tools and corporate, but OCR, HTR models, right? If anybody in the room is interested in taking archival documents and somehow transforming them, making them searchable, keyword searchable, maybe even creating full transcriptions of those, and I heard a little bit, right, also about very specific kinds of court records, or kind of records which even for specialists today are kind of difficult to read. Bringing native fluency in a language isn't necessarily helpful there, right? So there can be levels of kind of content fluency plus linguistic fluency that are kind of required to create those, to create like say a model for transcribing, irrespective of directionality or whatever. There can be a lot of cultural information that's required, and academic sort of fluency.
It's an opportunity for people often to train in that as well, right?
Absolutely. No, that's very much how I see it. I mean, for me at that level, when we're talking about, paleographic challenges, I mean, for me, it's usually also court records, but in Arabic or the historical texts that I would love to be able to have be machine readable, it's a very, very clear way to train graduate students, right? To be able to have facility in those texts. And there are undergrads, at Stanford, I've found with some level of surprise, who also are able to work in those environments, but that is a different, it's a different kind of project work with a different skill set, I would say.
I did a lot of work with religious texts, specifically Buddhist texts, and I had the good fortune in Taiwan many years ago to lead a team of people who were transcribing Chinese Buddhist texts and marking them up, full TEI markup, onomastica, and the whole works. And we had lots of people who were religiously committed to that task because it's a religious text and propagating that text. And they were native speakers of Chinese or Mandarin or Taiwanese or Hakka. But the texts we're working on are classical. It's like giving someone a native speaker in English Sir Gawain the Green Knight or something. You can't read this stuff without training, without specialized. But these people, we had lots of people who were really keen to do that, and it was really interesting to be able to bridge those kind of worlds. They were doing work that we couldn't get people to do. We couldn't get graduate students in America to do that kind of work at that level. But at the same time, they still needed this extra. And that was what was a large part of what was in it for them. So finding ways to make those kinds of things cooperative, so that people can get a lot out of that experience by contributing to those projects is there's often a lot of two ways directionality that can go on.
So we've made an argument a couple of times. I have a colleague, we wrote an article about right-to-left languages and thinking about right-to-left languages as they exist. So right-to-left languages, so Arabo-Persian script languages, and the way that they coexist, the contrast between the way that they're studied in the area studies approach, like coming from a Western university, and then the way that those languages are dealt with digitally in the societies in the living societies in which they're actually used, right? And the argument that we made there, and it's an interesting, maybe kind of a nuance or an extension of what you just talked about, is that somehow the the technical and infrastructural work that's done in powerful universities that are often incidentally far away from those societies, is really done at the exclusion of those communities of linguistic practice, right? And that our argument was that in an equitable world, right, that one would imagine that multilingual DH work would somehow be a bridge between places. Now, of course, that can't be the case for ancient Greek. Well, maybe. I mean, maybe there are enough people in Greece that can sort of navigate ancient Greek. But Latin, let's take, or Sanskrit, or something where there's no Sanskrit still, right? Still, right? Sorry, I'm trying to think of I think of languages which are just not used anymore. Just Sanskrit is definitely not one. But Ottoman is a great example also. If you confront Ottoman again, you think about Ottoman. Ottoman is a language which, in its archival form, exists in a completely different script and linguistic form, right? And so people nowadays have been cut off from that, and it's really only a specialist group of people who've learned. So my point being that idealistically, that multilingual DH would be a bridge between those two worlds, and yet in reality, that's actually much harder to make happen than you would think. Right.
Which is why I enjoyed being part of that particular project so much, because I really felt like we were able to be successful in that context. And it was partly the nature of the text, of course. With religious texts, that you have many more avenues there.
But what I'd like to invite you to think about, and we've kind of danced around a certain idea in the OpenGulf project, is that whereas the OpenGulf project, I mean, you may not have missed the fact that OpenGulf does carry a little bit of significance beyond just a random term, but right, the kind of opening of a space, right, up for thinking about what data and information and I would just call sort of data literacy means in different places is really different. There is a gulf between places of the world in terms of the ways that people know how to manipulate and use data, and the kind of sovereignty that gives original societies to be able to use that data in those ways. So one of the things that we sort of danced around is that project has a different valence in different places, right? In a Stanford context, that project is very meaningful because it talks about a part of the world which is not usually talked about in digital humanities. That, by the way, doesn't really work in the Gulf as a reason for talking about that project, right? People, if you were to say that, they would be like, well, okay, we want to be seen on a global stage, but that's not enough to put a lot of investment into it. It's on the other side, it's actually an opportunity for something to be learned there. So I think that's what I'm just trying to get at, what you just is reinforce what you just said about. Because I'm sure that in that particular environment, people were learning skills. They were like learning things. They were learning how to deal with, and they were learning the stakes of dealing with digital computational environments there that maybe they didn't have outside of that project. So multilingual DH has to kind of take into account that the meaning of doing this work in different places is different. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, just an argument.
There were so many things brought up when we went around the room.
I'm curious. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
No.
I want to change the topic a little bit to like how to formulate this the best way. So like I started interfacing with a lot of computer scientists.
Yep.
And there's some emerging interest at Stanford. Like there was a workshop that both me and Peter of this room like were present at about like worldwide knowledge and like sort of like the history genie is what they called it. They have like South African newspapers, English language newspapers that they digitized. So like, but then what I sort of so there's a bit of like technological advancement that does help multilingual digital humanities more so than it does for English. Like the change of progress is higher with these models in a context where you don't have anything. So you go from like 0 to like something partial, as opposed to for English, like a lot of major languages, a lot of stuff just exists. So that marginal, like you might not need to turn to like these models if you're already content with the kind of research that you're doing because you work on 20th century English literature. Like everything is anyway typed up in a computer. So like, how do we sort of like navigate this, this technological sort of like this socio-technological setting as sort of like people more in the digital humanities? Oh, look at everyone.
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I think the elephant in the room is the LLM, right? I mean, the possibility of of leveraging different ways of thinking about bridges between languages. And I don't know enough about that. Your talk that was in South Africa was really great for that purpose, right? For demonstrating, I mean, Meredith gave this really great talk about how machine translation works with historical sources and all the kinds of things that are built into LLM, the guide rails that are built into LLM for dealing with certain kinds of topics can cause them to skip over things that are potentially problematic or just distort or hallucinate totally with respect to the originals. But I think that's an interesting question in the room. I don't know, is anybody thinking about leveraging the LLM for the purpose of moving between languages in an interesting way, or what the stakes of that are?
I mean, Haidar, I think your point about watching students use translations like automatically translated Arabic, I think that's what you were talking about. Got me thinking along these lines.
Yeah, or the vice versa. So in here, when you have I have Arabic resources, and so the student would come just because the English is ready and they go with there, and that's when they start quoting it. I try to say this is not one-to-one match, but it's a way to start. But I guess more future-wise, are we actually helping in a way student not even interested to learn the language, because it's now with the AI, it is so easy to bring that, but at the same time, it's also in a way contradict what Tam said, is an opportunity for students to learn about the different culture without spending 3, 4, 5 years maybe to learn the language. Where we kind of the balance we can try to find. So I'm working in the projects around 3.8 million documents about there's a new collection, nobody have seen it, and it's an era of dark side in Iraq, and the question is using the AI, extracting the metadata, generating the metadata. If you do the traditional way, it might take me a few years. If I'm using now incorporating the AI, I might do it in the next 6 to 1 year. So from 0 discovery to 70% or 80% discovery, with understanding there is no accuracy, there's a lot of issues where we have to make that decision.
Yeah, those are the stakes.
What are you skewing in that process?
Yeah, and it's coming very quite, sometimes to 90% with the Arabic language and AI today, but still.
And to bring other languages into the problem, I mean, the technical languages become something that helps someone on the project, to be somewhat conversant in exactly how LLMs are built and trained, because otherwise things can be very difficult. I mean, we've certainly seen that. To back up a little bit, we've seen that, just embedding spaces, just projecting multiple languages into the same space for multilingual search is potentially of interest to a lot of people and really powerful. But again, it does sort of fall down with issues when you run into historical contingencies like poorly transliterated names and things like that, and knowing how that happens and when it's going to happen, particularly, and possibly working around it can be really useful. Or there's this crazy example of this one pretty good Arabic handwritten text recognition model that had been fine-tuned, based on the Microsoft Transformer OCR system. And at some point they realized that even though you don't want to do this anymore, just reversing the image still generated better results, because the image encoder was still originally trained on left to right languages, and it was expecting the invisible pixels that mark the end of the line to be on the right side of the image, even though obviously the language model was totally right to left fluent. And they figured that out. We never figured that out in time, unfortunately. So that kind of thing does happen.
So what you're bringing up here is like super interesting idea, because for me, I guess when I sit on Teach Digital Humanities, I work on building and developing kind of digital humanities research in certain domains. And so I often think about this question of multilingual DH coming from a human perspective, right? And from certain assumptions about what it means to be a multilingual, or what it means to deploy multilingual human resources in lots of interesting ways. And I feel like that gets in the way sometimes of actually doing things, right? Like there might actually be other ways of doing it which are not so human-centered. And so I guess a question that I have that comes up, I think I'm hoping that this will come up also in Lisbon, is to what extent multilingual DH in the world that we're inhabiting really needs to be in a deep conversation with critical AI, and thinking about the way that machines are dealing with this kinds of questions, right? And so whether to what extent that can be even incorporated into an already crowded academic training, right?
Yeah.
Like how do you bridge that? You know, because that's a kind of a serendipitous accident, I guess, serendipitous. I don't think anyone had that. I don't know, did somebody have that was that a theory that they then tested, or was that something that they came across like penicillin in the petri dish?
Yeah, I think it was kind of like that. But I assume someone had more of a fundamental understanding of how models work.
Yeah, right.
When you understand how the models are built and how they work, there are things you try, like for example, you scale up your images and you get better results for no particular reason, even though there's no more information there than there was previously. And there are any number of other issues about the way you format data when you're working with models, or the way you format inputs to these models, that if you know how they were trained and how they work, then you can make intelligent guesses about what might work. But then what you're doing in that circumstance is learning to think more like the model thinks. The model is not learning to think more like we think. We're actually shaping ourselves to these new tools. And people get, I think, my opinion is people get very mixed up about understanding the relationship between the operator and the tool in those kinds of contexts for exactly that reason. There are lots of other good examples of that kind of thing, where searching for images, for example. There was an anecdote I read recently about someone trying to search their image collection for a peanut spill on the road, and they couldn't find it. But when they searched for pebbles, they found it. Because the classifiers aren't used to peanut spills, right? They aren't used to pebbles in those kinds of environments, you know. And understanding, my guess is, and I don't know if you know any more about it than I do, but my guess is that someone who worked with those models before had the idea to flip it, and it worked, and that it was serendipitous in a way, but also the product of knowing how they work.
Guessing.
It was the same paper where they cut off the sentences and put it into a square shape, because it works better with the matrices. Instead of one long line, you have that line that has been square. Right, that's the Hudson paper.
Well, we have this whole inherited idea of what it means to be multilingual, right? That, I mean, even the W3 has something, has this whole concept of localized interfaces, and that to be truly multilingual, what we really need is to provide tools in all languages for people, right? And I've kind of argued for a while that actually providing tool interfaces in languages is actually not very helpful at all for researchers. It's actually understanding the kind of under the hood or black box functioning of systems and the way that they handle scripts or directionality or languages or punctuation or whatever it is, right? That's involved. That's actually where the goal is, and that's where you actually can begin to imagine. I mean, I live in a part of the world where, and have lived in a part of the world where the interfaces for software were not in the native language for decades, right? And this is a bit strange for someone who comes from a dominant multilingual society, who has an expectation of a machine acting with them as if it is interacting in their native language, right? And so there are plenty of parts I think there's plenty, in other words, what I'm getting at, there's plenty of lessons to be taken from the rest of the world in the way that the rest of the world has dealt with technology. That's perhaps dislocating and a little bit it's estranged. I mean, we're estranged. People are estranged with the way the machines work, but maybe that's actually a good thing for for the education. Now, maybe it's kind of giving up a secure multilingual, or not sorry, secure monolingual dominant world self in looking at machines and thinking that well, actually maybe there's something else going on there. That's, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah, I think I think it makes a lot of sense. The problem that I see to some degree is that this is exactly the opposite of the approach that we're trying to the big players are trying to take. I've said before, I think that one of the key moments in the current AI boom was the moment someone decided to put it in a chat interface. That was an important decision, and it's shaped an awful lot of the conversations that have come afterwards. And we're deliberately, all of the major offerings right now are designed around obscuring exactly how it works. They're specifically obfuscating that and trying to present it in ways that are actually and that are specifically other than the way it actually works. And so we end up with an inherent tension there, I think.
But I think there are definitely small spaces. Let's just take the Arabic world, for example. Siri will not talk to you in Emirati. She talks to you in Saudi or in Egyptian. And this is a market-driven question, right? This is about like, it's that those are the places where you have, or Algerian, right? Because you have many hundred, many tens of millions of people who are a potential audience for that. And so if you are a Yemeni Arabic speaker or an Emirati Arabic speaker, or I mean, even small Qatari or something like that, right? Like your experience of difference with the machine, there's always a kind of an experience of difference with the machine and the way that's handling it out. Maybe that gap will close, but I think there's really lots of interesting conversations to be had with people, and this is why this kind of UX perspective, telling the user stories from around the world, I think is actually so powerful, is that it allows us to listen to people who still maintain a complicated relationship with the technologies that they are being, well, let's not say forced to use, but are being brought to their doorstep.
A lot of peer pressure.
A lot of pressure there.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Caleb, but you mentioned something about the way that using home languages in an education environment, and that's something that I'm quite interested in, the way that people, because I don't think we understand as well as we think we do the way that people code switch, like English language learners in schools in America, for example, and so our perspectives around making the machines work like humans do, or thinking of multilingualism in that way, in the way that you described, maybe making it less human-centered. But I don't know that we understand exactly what human multilingualism is very well. I wondered if there's anything that you thought that might connect into that specifically. I'm thinking of the ways in which education attempting to teach kids to read, for example, in their home language, is thought to be better than teaching them to read first in a second language, like English, for example, if they're here in the States. And these kinds of ideas, I think they feed into our understanding of what multilingualism is and how multilingualism is socially stratified as well. Being a second language learner, if that second language is English in America, is a negative thing, right? Being a second language learner, if your first language is English, is great. You're getting your college CV ready, right? And there's a lot of socioeconomic stuff that's fed into our understanding of multilingualism at a human level. And we're reproducing a lot of those forms in the way that we think about it in when we do this digital humanities or in other digital spaces where where multilingualism happens. I don't know if that connects with the reason you're interested in being here.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure how that works. I want to learn more, but like we do understand multilingualism as a human concept in education really strangely, because it is like, especially in the US, which is what I'm most familiar with, is like when we're teaching people English, like English as a second language learners, the emphasis is on like pushing English as the primary mode of instruction. And then oftentimes, they'll lose their home language. Or even sometimes there's new research specifically in California and Texas, because that's where there's the largest populations, but that they're trying to move more towards like dual language practices. So they're using Spanish and English, but some of these kids don't have any schooling in Spanish. So the teachers will give them like this huge complicated text in Spanish and English. They'll have like a double translation, and the kids can't understand either of them because because they don't know either language well enough to read text. So I think that's like a problem, and it might be a tool where we can use like digital humanities to try and help, transform these texts into languages that the kids can understand, because sometimes it's not an official language that is spoken widely. Maybe it's a mix of Spanish and English. Maybe
You want Spanish, right?
Yeah,
Spanish, right?
yeah. Like maybe in the sciences they understand certain concepts in English because that's where they learned them, and then in other things. But so maybe digital humanities can be used in that way.
Well, this is why I think for us that focusing on multilinguality and on the kind of infinite number of permutations that could exist in a particular system is really helpful, if only rhetorically and positionally, just to begin the conversation, right? Because when you walk into the question of multilingualism, especially as it is promulgated by states, you walk into a highly normative conversation that is not actually in touch with realities, like lived realities on the ground, right? It brings all kinds of stuff to it. And I really don't think that's what we want to be doing when we're talking about multilingual PH, right? I don't think we want to like be necessarily policing all of those borders or imposing all of those. I mean, I guess a question is, is DH used? Is it a way of as you have suggested, is it a way of perhaps impacting policy or impacting education? Maybe. I think that a lot of people in the room here are coming at it from the DH is a research practice, right? Or perhaps maybe a way of interacting pedagogically with a community. So it's a little bit of a different perspective, but I still don't think we want to have necessarily that. We don't want that normative baggage that comes from that concept even in research projects. Yeah, please.
So I think this was slightly kind of touched upon by what you just said and also what you said earlier, but so I think in the archival materials, we see like layers of colonial power hierarchy inherent in the language. And I think in some way that the infrastructure is also like, promoting sort of that power hierarchy. So what are some, I'm curious, if you know any sort of techniques or technologies or projects that are trying to mitigate this?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a really great question.
I'm only laughing because OpenGulf is a project that tries to do that. We've been talking about this for many years. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm actually going to open it to the room. I think that would be a really interesting question. Is anybody familiar with, because in a way, one version of digital humanities is that you take a set of tools to affect or to create or to execute research projects with a set of materials, and that you then use tools to represent results to the world. That's a very, very basic but distorted view, right, of what I think of what digital humanities might be. There's a critical perspective on that, which says that in that interaction between the complex multi-layered materials and the complex infrastructures that put certain kind of pressure upon those materials, that there's a set of interactions there which lead to critical conversations that are beneficial for understanding both worlds, right? So I don't know if anybody has particular ideas about a place where that actually happened. I can tell you that I wrote with an autonomist in my home university. We wrote about an example of using HTR and using HTR in an attempt to not just transcribe documents, by which I might mean take one script that's in a document and reproduce it in the same script in another document, but we tried to jump scripts. So we were trying to almost sort of to hack the technology that was set up to do one thing to try to get it to do something else. And so in this specific case, the idea was trying to take Ottoman Turkish and make it into Latin lettered Turkish. And of course, what happens, my autonomist can speak about this better than I can, is that there are all kinds of weird distortions that take place because there's not a one-to-one relationship between those two languages, right? And so the models were always making guesses and trying to like come up with, and so what you ended up with was a kind of okay research corpus to work by, but by no means a native normative Turkish language kind of a thing. And we've written about that. We've written about that as a tension that exists. So anyway, that's a bit the way, that's the thing that comes to mind first of all. Does anybody else have something where they think about like the confrontation between what tools can do and what they impose and the multi-layered complexities of your source material?
I mean, even like sort of stuff like there are a lot of tools built on the assumption that when you scale language up, that there's a Diffusion distribution, right? You can like sort of what ends up happening with most frequent words are the ones that are least sort of like they're like the a at like whatever like function words or like stop words. Like you can just get rid of them. Like you can get rid of the top like 1,000 words in your corpus, and you would end up with meaningful words if you have like 5 million words. So like those distributions only work for languages where the diversity of inflection is minimal, like English, like sort of, you know, like many Latin languages, where like, but not all of them in Turkey, where like, you know, like the sort of like in English, the most like to be is probably the verb with like 7 versions, and that's like the top. After that, it's like 3 versions per verb or something like that. So you can legitimately do that, but you don't have like, but with agglutinative languages or like languages that have more complex syntax, like the morphological complexity, that doesn't work. So like in a way, like of course the Diffusion distribution in the pure mathematical sense works, but not the implication of that being the top most popular just gets rid of them. That would be I want to push back against your definition of DH before.
Please.
There's a definition that like, and
which definition was it that you're
no, not all of them.
All of them.
I think all of those, I agree with all of them in theory, but in practice, like in places like MLA, like AHA, even in like places where like sort of even at ad hoc, more or less English is like digital humanities is synonymous with computational text analysis with English materials. Like the actual practice of like when you look at the scholars of DH and who identifies as a DH scholar, who does what, it's like 90% of them probably, I'm just giving bullshit numbers, are people who are either like in English departments or like they're like working with English materials, working with 19th and 20th century materials in most cases, in computational text analysis. So not even so much the image. That's like the majority of the group of DH scholars that we interface with, and then that is for me like the main contestation actually.
Institutionally, English departments are central.
Yeah, and they'll, it's the Big Tent debates, which was declared dead in the MLA, like this past January. They were like, the Big Tent, that phase is over. Yeah, so I don't know. I think that's probably like another thing. Multilinguality, like as a political position, should also be academic political position.
So again, I'll push back against that, saying that if you actually just step beyond the borders of the United States or North America, I don't think that's true anymore, right? I don't think that French DH people are like running toward English corpora because they're easy to use,
but then they do the
or
French
Italians,
like,
or Turks, or Arabs. I think that on the other hand, one of the sort of central tensions I guess I would get to in DH education or DH pedagogy, right, is it to get your chops in learning and gaining DH skills, you have to pass through a kind of a globalized pedagogy, which itself is largely centered on English documents, right? And there have been debates at things like the Programming Historian, which is a super interesting website, right? And it's a journal, actually, not just a website, it's a journal for publishing DH tutorials. And inside of the Programming Historian, I see the very tension between multilingualisms and multilinguality, because on the one hand, the Programming Historian, to declare itself a global journal, saw its answer as being to translate its tutorials into what it considers to be world languages, which are French, Spanish, and Portuguese, which get a lot of people in the globe, right? Those are big languages for big countries. They are not, however, Chinese, Arabic, I don't know, we can go on, right? There's a lot of other languages that it could be in. Although I would sort of claim that weirdly enough, people who are Chinese or Arabic speakers probably have a whole lot more experience reading English language scientific material than, but whatever, I don't want to go into that. Okay, so,
Yes.
but the interesting thing about that that tension is that there's this, on the one hand, the translation into these world languages, and then on the other hand, the tutorials that go with that are themselves founded on certain, let's say, linguistic functionalities that are deeply baked into the tools, right? And so to kind of just translate, I mean, my colleague Antonio Rojas has written about this, right? To just take a stylometry tutorial and that is working on the Federalist Papers, which is like a very American debate, right? To take that and just translate that into Spanish, like who cares, right? Like, I mean, it's a weird thing to do. It's sort of like saying to learn this, to be brought in, and you're right to say that in a way that there's a power. There's like a whole nexus of power built up around English as an important language. To learn DH, to authenticate yourself in a DH world, you have to pass through this first. And this puts this idea of internationalization and localization, which is a W3 ideal, it puts it under a lot of pressure, because the idea of that is that somehow interfaces around the world can just be made to all look the same. and as almost as a business model, interfaces can be expanded across the whole world, and we don't have to do any deeper retooling of anything. We don't have to think about how language and culture makes a difference, right, in all of these processes. But I think that's actually changing pretty fast. I mean, maybe not seen from here, maybe not seen even from a global DH organization, but you know, there are people in Kyrgyzstan who are working on Kyrgyz and doing really interesting things with NLP in Kyrgyz. And there are people in a Russian context who are doing really, really interesting things. And now, whether that actually bubbles up to global attention or not, whether it kind of is allowed to step up and be seen as an equivalent version of DH on the global scene, that's another question.
Or DH even, right? Like I know a lot of Uzbek materials, especially because Uzbeks work a lot on lemmatization, which was a task I was interested in. It's mostly NLP. Like ACL does publish those, right? Like so it becomes a part of like NLP research, but not so much. But I also don't see that much of a difference between French working on French than Americans working on English.
Yes.
Like so, like I think it's they're not working on Algerian, right? Like so they're like or like Moroccan or like whatever. They're like still working on their like 17th century beautiful French texts.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to do this kind of work. So I mean, like I was involved with the TEI for many, many years, and in getting in things like the Gaiji module, for example, which allows you to do characters that aren't part of the standard Unicode set, for example, is very important for working with Japanese material. There's a whole Japanese DH scene where they are doing Japanese DH in Japan. How much it intersects with the JADH publishes a lot of interesting stuff in English, but they also have a full parallel publication in Japanese. For example, but it's very hard to do that kind of localization work. So when we localized the TEI P5 guidelines into Chinese, we changed all the examples from Shakespeare to Sima Qian and things like that. But the basic provisions of it are still geared around Western languages with white space tokenization and all of those kinds of things that make that kind of work so much easier. And the question for me has always been: is it better to have more resources available in other contexts that have been translated from English, or fewer and localize it, because it's a lot of work to localize this stuff. It's one thing to translate it, it's twice as much work to localize it very often properly. And so there's always going to be a tension between producing more resources and producing fewer resources of better quality, and producing indigenous resources from whole cloth, as it were.
There are not very many programming historian lessons that have been written in a language besides English that are then translated out into world languages.
There's a couple in Chinese because I peer reviewed a couple of them.
Yeah, very small, but I'm guessing that's going to change, right? I don't know. I mean, we'll see with my guess is that will definitely change. I mean, there's one of the, I think, one of the issues about bringing the multilingual conversation to the ad hoc conference as not, I mean, first of all, I feel that it cannot be the only place at which this takes place, nor can it be only at Daria or only at ACH or only in any of those organizations have their own sort of constellations of power and concepts about language and about multilingualism and multilinguality that would I feel kind of take over the potential of that manifesto. But the issue about bringing it there is that, of course, you know, ADHO is sort of structurally pretty set. It's pretty what G20 like it's very focused on G7 maybe, right? Sort of it's very focused on very powerful nations of the world that have correspondingly developed university systems and research cultures, right, that feed into those. And so it's very hard to imagine, you know, it does float around the world to certain places, but it's very hard to get it to go other places. It's very confrontational, I think, to the kinds of research that go on. And anyway,
It's a constant topic of conversation.
definitely, and a long-standing one.
Yeah.
I think we have a few minutes to wrap up. We don't have to go on for the full. We don't have to go on for the full session. Anybody else wants to say something or add something to the conversation today? The community conversation we had today. Yeah, Ali, please.
So from oral to written transition, we'll speak all kind of different ways. When you write them down, there's a distortion.
Yep.
Distortion one. And then this written version was corrected and canonized. Distortion two. And the canonization is transliterated for Arabic or for Turkish, for instance, or edited by the modernist scholars, whatnot, distortion three.
Right.
It's translated to English or French, whatever, another distortion. And now we have another distortion. The way that I look at the kind of sequences of distortions in code, whatever, translations. So maybe DH and AI, they have a huge impact on what we're gonna do, definitely. But this is a part of the sequence, I guess. So it's not necessarily ontologically different than what happened when oral was translated to written. So it's a kind of a, if we look at that way, the impact of written, the impact of print culture, the impact of editing, the impact of translations, colonial context, and then now this. And then think about critical DH. What would be our, perspective to this, especially for historical texts I'm talking about?
That's a great question. I mean, we published an article recently in a Chinese DH journal, or a Chinese American co-production new journal called "Everyone Leaves a Trace." It was specifically thinking about this project where we're looking at scribal impact in manuscripts. But one of the larger pieces of the argument is that it's not just those initial, so precisely what you said, it's not just those initial passages from maybe oral to written, or from someone writing something down and abbreviating it or whatever, but those kinds of traces work their way all the way up the chain into a fascinating landscape now of editorial practices where one's computational choices make all kinds of, or pre-computational one's editorial choices in just transcribing something literally leave a mark on documents. Tobias Hodel has this really great article in German called "The End of the Edition," in which he's actually talking about how, from a historian's perspective, not from a literary historian's perspective, but from a historian's perspective, that taking, like doing HTR, for example, handwritten text recognition with historical documents, it's actually not about creating an addition, it's about creating a set of computational byproducts that themselves are pseudo-editorial, right? And so as we're moving forward, the kind of like the one of the problems is that the speed with which we're moving forward is kind of accelerating the potential divergences between people's editorial processes. And so what we're kind of ending up with is like lots and lots of stuff that needs a new way of being compared or a new way of being brought together, a new way of studied together that kind of challenge histories of normalization.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, it's a great question. It's a super interesting question. And so I would say it's also, it's not, I mean, it diverges a tiny bit from a strict kind of idea of multilingual meaning between languages. But if it's between ways of representing languages, that's a really interesting point. Really, really interesting.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is, so my own doctoral research, I studied text on the transition between oral and written text. Nice. And then again, when they were translated from Indic languages into Chinese languages, and then again when they were canonized in Chinese with the introduction of woodblock printing and things like that. And in each of these stages, you have a form of ossification, perhaps, of something that was previously more fluid. And in each case, there's a distortion or a transformation, and in each opportunity, there is a canonization process. And a lot of the work that I was interested in doing was trying to untangle some of those things. And I see there's a lot of, when you then look at the transition into the digital world, you see similar things going on. You know, you think of the first digital editions of text. You think of the Index Thomisticus and all the history of DH being bound up with these kinds of transmissions of different textual traditions. And one of the things that concerns me about the modern advent of the LLM world is the extent to which that transition represents another form of this kind of canonization that we have no control over and that we don't understand very well. And we're seeing an enclosure of the commons by these, by these models that represents an even bigger transformation, distortion, whatever, than these previous pseudo-canonical events in the past. And so understanding that as we're in the middle of, I think to some degree, some of it is inevitable, just as it was in the past. And when we're looking at the first written witnesses of texts that we know were composed orally, for example, we can do interesting things about inferring back what different oral editions or oral traditions, I should say, in the context of the Barnaca traditions, the traditions of reciting communities that would have kept these texts alive before the first time they were ever written down. But what we're going through now is potentially an even bigger example of something like that. And I think it's very important as people in this space, people trained in digitally and trained as humanists, that we try and document, try and understand what's going on in front of our eyes and understand the ways in which we can preserve the things of value, because things change and we can't stop things changing. Yeah, but we can look at what's happening, what we might be losing, what we value, and what we want to fight to preserve through that transition. The fights that we can and can't win, of course.
And we can do archaeology.
Right, but it will be more and more difficult to do that, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can do linguistic archaeology, so there are ways. We have a tradition of trying to understand what the original oral witnesses of texts were before. In the case of the South Asian tradition, very often our first physical witness is a 16th century version because it's been copied repeatedly on palm leaves that rot, for example. But we know that the texts were composed in the 3rd century before the Common Era, for example. And we can do that kind of archaeology with those texts. It's going to get more and more difficult to do that when our access to that kind of stuff is mediated through things like language models and things like that. And increasingly, I think that there's a danger that we're going to find ourselves in a position where we don't have access to that kind of stuff because of the way, the access to this information is being,
especially in a data sparse world, right?
Yeah, right.
Hallucinate and make up all kinds of things.
Right, and slide over the interesting things. I mean, these models, they regress to the mean so much. If something particularly out of the ordinary in the middle of a text, well, then it's quite likely to be skipped because the text will produce the most likely outcome, right? Or the LLM will produce the most likely outcome. And so we're eliding the very things that we're most interested in as researchers, the outliers, the interesting things, the bits that don't quite chime properly and therefore provoke you to think, why is it like that,
That is all the reason that a critical AI conversation belongs in the center of humanities education, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally.
But also,
2 weeks ago, I think, I don't know if you've seen this article by New York Times, Agatha Christie, who died in 1976, now will be in the class. And so basically having this, all the transitioning, today now is becoming a person, Agatha will speak to you about her work and then AI, because when you have the all content generated by this person, the AI can know that, but it seemed to me eventually, no one go to read the book of Agatha Christie and rely on the search and becoming almost a primary and kind of relying.
And video, not even just text.
Yeah.
Look at your face and everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I teach a course which is a kind of a data and society course, in which is a segment called Digital Afterlives, right? And that the Digital Afterlives segment is trying to explore precisely these kinds of questions. That's a great one to bring in, but usually that conversation turns around what happens to your data when you pass away, what happens to, the whole, what is the sovereignty of one's own data, whatever, into the future, and people trying to project themselves into somewhat eternal beings by, et cetera, et cetera. But there are lots of creepy questions that come up alongside of that. Like if you had 20 years of texting with a lover or partner on your phone, would you consent to that becoming a chatbot that you could communicate with once that person passes away?
And the corollary, will you get the chance to consent or decline?
Consent or not?
Will you even get that choice?
I think we've gone a little bit
Yeah,
into speculative space. It's amazing. It's a great, beautiful, super interesting conversation. But probably, and I think we have come to the end of our time, right? So I want to thank you for